especially to Madeline. We can probably hear you again if you press the button, Madeline. There we go. And yeah, and are you happy just to dive in for us? Is that all right?
Yes, I'm happy. So, Rob posed me the question: what is God's Spirit? What may God's Spirit be saying to the churches at the moment? Which is really interesting question for us all to consider. And I've got two relatively short talks and questions at the end. For those of you who weren't here at the beginning, I'm the vicar of St. Stephen's Church, and I've been there for 11 years. So the first talk is, and I don't have any PowerPoint. I do have a visual aid, but I'm not doing anything fancy, I'm afraid. So it's just me and you and some words in between. So the first talk is called Count Your Assets, Don't Rehearse Your Deficits. Count your assets, don't rehearse your deficits. And so just taking a few moments looking at Matthew's Gospel, I will read to you. So it's the feeding of the 5,000, which you will know very well. Now, and the verse that is key is Matthew 14, verse 17. But this is what leads up to it. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." And they replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds, and all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. The disciples were not stupid. They could see that they had a problem. There were an awful lot of people in this very deserted place. They saw the problem and they came up with a solution, and they told Jesus what to do: send them away. So they saw the deficit. They saw that this crowd, and in fact in other translations it tells us it would take them several days' wages or months' wages or years' wages to feed these people. They saw the deficit. They saw the problem. And Jesus asked them only to provide the little they had. But they had to provide something. Because if there weren't any loaves and there weren't any fish, then Jesus could not have broken the bread and distributed the fish. So the little they had was more than enough. On Easter Sunday, I was sitting in the garden. We were in complete lockdown, and I'm a bit of a gardening enthusiast, and I share my garden with some rather beatnik blackbirds. I also have a lot of red worms in my garden, and so the blackbirds think that wherever there is any soil, if they dig a bit, they will be rewarded with a tasty worm. When you sow seeds in a large pot, all you see is the brown earth. I have actually been told by a child in our online service recently how to solve it, and the real solution is holly leaves, but I didn't know that then. So I have a large tub with lettuce seeds in, and the potential for these to be dug up. I have no way of covering them. I can't go to Wilkinson's. I can't go and get whatever I might need. Some things come in a large piece of bubble wrap, and I have some old florist's wire that I've kept, and I thread the forest wire into the bubble wrap, and I create a dome. So I now have a large tub with my lettuce seeds in, and a bubble wrap dome with some very nice ribs of wire. But I have to keep it on the tub because it will blow away. I have nothing. I can't find anything. But in a drawer in the kitchen is a tin of tiny little elastic bands. I mean, tiny little elastic bands. My guess is that you might also have a tin of tiny little elastic bands. And my guess is that, like me, you will never use them. They will just sit in the drawer. So in the sunshine on Easter Sunday, I knit together the tiny little elastic bands. I'm glad you find it amusing. It was extremely serious at the time. And I make 3 long strands, and then I plait them together. And then I put them around my tub and my bubble wrap, and I attach them. And in fact, I have a fairly fancy nappy pin which holds them in place. If I had not been in lockdown, I would not have known what I had. I would not have looked for the tiny little elastic bands, and I wouldn't have used them. They would have been there. They would have been there with the capacity to make what I needed to hold my dome over my newly sown seeds. If I had that problem and wasn't in lockdown, I would have gone to Wilkinson's and bought something. So what I think the Holy Spirit is saying to us in this time is that you in the church, and we at St. Stephen's, and you in your churches are likely to have assets that we have taken for granted. And rather than looking at what we don't have, which we are always tempted to do, and I would say to you, when you have responsibility of really difficult buildings, which you will have, I mean, I know one of them, and the architects and the DAC tell you that everything is going to cost you thousands and thousands of pounds because it has to be in appropriate materials, it's very easy for us to get into the mindset of what we haven't got. If only we raised this amount of money, then we could do this and we could do that. Seriously, I've been in that situation myself and thought only about what I didn't have and not what I did have. So in a minute, I'm going to suggest that you talk to one another about what you have as a community, not only within the church, but also within your church, within your village communities, because you may have people who want to work with you who you have never seen, because you have thought that you had to be the provider of all good, and that as the church, your witness was to save. Obviously, your witness is to save spiritually, but often we think we have to save people rather than work with them. Recently, I have been talking with a group in London based at St Martin in the Fields, and they've done some work on social action, because what a lot of the churches are doing in our present time is they're engaging in a lot of social action. And of course we have to be really careful about that, because A, we don't want to exhaust ourselves, and also we have to know what our role is relative to the governmental bodies. And this is a book, For Good. It reverses, doesn't it? The camera reverses it. Does it say, can you see For Good? Okay. This is quite a short book, written by Sam Wells, Russell Rook and David Barclay. Russell Rook was involved in running Spring Harvest. He's from the Salvation Army, and it's a little book about how does the church now relate to the community around us, when up until relatively recently, the community have seen us possibly as a minority interest hobby and thought of us as possibly irrelevant, and certainly not wanted to work with us because we might be unprofessional or whatever. But with the change in the economy, and certainly in Norwich, the city council being stretched in every direction, and the church beginning to engage more with caring in the community, and I don't know whether you do lunch clubs or have done lunch clubs or toddler groups, or in which you have been very important in the community. And this book helps me a lot with this, because it also talks about assets rather than deficits, because it says very clearly that if we are to engage in social action in order to engage more with our community, we need to know that we are doing it in a different way from the way in which a governmental agency will do it. And our role is not to meet all the needs that we see, but our role is to name the assets. So not only within our own community, but within the community beyond the walls of the church. And that is a gift to your community. That is such a gift. Not that you will do lots and lots of things to help them out, although you may still do some things. but that you will see where the assets are, and you will encourage them to be used. So you will be like a catalyst within your communities, looking for where the value is in your communities. And some amazing things happen when you start to change your mindset. And I'm just on this journey. I'm on this journey, as well as you. And I'm just really bringing to you this change of attitudes. Because Jesus saved the world, we're inclined to think, because we are Jesus followers, we're inclined to think that we should save the world. It is only Jesus that saves the world. He is the one who saves the world for us and for our communities, and we cooperate with him, but we are not the salvation for our villages and our city. But we can have an incredibly important role to play that nobody else can play, because they don't have the Holy Spirit with them, showing them things, opening their eyes, seeing where the good is, fanning the good into bursting into flame, and everybody benefiting from the heat. So the question I had for you, and I can see Rob's put a question up there, is what are your assets? How might you use what you have got that you might possibly have taken for granted? How can you help each other to count assets and not rehearse deficits? It's really lovely to hear of all the things that you're doing, and how you're already very integrated with your communities in different ways. So this second short talk is called How You Respond to Your Circumstances Really Matters. It may sound a bit obvious, but I hope I'll show you what I mean. In 2002, Lend-Lease bought up the old chocolate factory in that enormous site, which is now Chapelfield. And St. Stephen's Church were given the opportunity by Lend-Lease as to whether to allow the public to walk through the churchyard. There was already a path there, because the vicarage to St. Peter Mancroft had been beyond the St. Stephen's churchyard. But now there were some fairly nasty car parks. Well, they were great if you wanted to park your car, but they were covered in graffiti, and they really looked very hideous. But the church had a genuine choice. Obviously, these are circumstances that they never expected, came completely out of the blue. I wasn't there. Hereward Cook was the vicar at the time. And Lend-Lease were quite keen, and there was some money to to landscape the churchyard. The churchyard had become a very unpleasant place. It had some very large trees, and being in the city centre, there was certainly drug dealing, and probably a lot worse. The congregation in that period was very small, between about 20-25 people, and one of the ladies would pick up the hypodermic needles on a Sunday morning before they started church. So they made the decision to allow the public to use the churchyard. And in fact, recently, I have found an article in a newspaper, in fact a letter to the editor, whereby it said it's extraordinary that Norwich is thriving when people are doing such terrible things like allowing people to walk through a churchyard. So it was not a popular move with some people. Some people will still not walk through the churchyard, thinking that the path goes over graves, which it doesn't. It seriously doesn't. The paths that are there have been there for hundreds of years. If the church hadn't done that, St. Stephen's would not be what it is today, because everything that has happened has its root in that decision. So they decided to work with people that they had no idea what they would be like. I mean, Lend-Lease are contractors, they are property developers, they are professional people, and in fact, to be fair, the church did get into a bit of a muddle and did sign up to something that they were then told that they needed not to, because they had allowed Lend-Lease to have rights over the path for far too little money. And so the registrar called back the contract and it was renegotiated. But the important thing was that the congregation were prepared to take a risk and to engage with people who were not church people. And as a result, the churchyard was landscaped. And when I arrived at St. Stephen's, Sally Clark, who some of you might know, was regularly counting our footfall. And at times, before they made the path better outside Superdry, we could have 50,000 people a week walking on that path. When I was 6 months old, my parents had met on board ship. My dad was a New Zealander and my mum English. My mum was a nurse on board ship, and my dad was travelling from Canada to Australia to do a second degree. And they met on board ship, absolutely insane. And I just warn you, please don't marry somebody who you have just met on board ship. They didn't know each other for very long. It was post-war. My mum was 32, my dad 27. And my mum went back to England. She got her savings together and she bought a one-way passage back to Australia. It was so crazy that when she arrived in Australia, she didn't recognise my dad because he had Brill creamed his hair, and so it was a much darker colour than when she knew him on board ship. It was actually a brilliant marriage, but the first year or so was pretty tricky. So they travelled. I was born. They travelled with me, aged 6 months, to New Zealand. The plan was to go to New Zealand for my mum to meet my dad's parents, and then to go on to England for my dad to meet my mum's parents, and then probably settle in Canada, which would have been perfect for them because it was neither of their cultures. But on their way to New Zealand, there was a call over the tannoy that said there had been a case of polio identified in one of the passengers, and there was no need to panic. Well, winding forward, my dad got polio. He had a lumbar puncture. It was pumped all around his body. So at the age of 27, he just escaped with his life, but was disabled from the lower back down from then on. So they had no roof over their heads. They lived with my grandparents, but they had no independent roof. They had no means of income. My dad was a scientist. He'd not written up his PhD. He was an eternal optimist and had done the scientific work, but it hadn't been. So they were in effect destitute. And they started to, the community surrounded them. They were in a small town in New Zealand, and people rallied around them. Somebody sold their walnut harvest to give them money. Food would arrive on the doorstep of my grandmother's house. My grandfather found a scientist who could listen to my dad and start writing some stuff down. And they made choices. They made choices. They made a choice to believe in God and not blame God. There was a nurse who eventually became a Roman Catholic nun who believed in prayer for healing and had her community praying for them. This is in the 1950s. There were Methodists who gave money and helped them and supported them. And they chose to run into God, but they also chose to take risks. In fact, I've got the letters that my father went to rehabilitation down in the South Island, and I'm writing a book about some of this because it's informed the way in which we've operated at St. Stephen's, but it was already happening before I arrived. So we have identified what I call grace responses. That is, responses that pull on the heartstrings of God, and He just can't resist you when you do these things. And I've spent the last 18 months looking back at all that's happened at St. Stephen's and identifying 8 ways in which we have responded that have brought more grace, not just for ourselves, but for our whole community. If you think of the churchyard in St. Stephen's, you will know that thousands of people, in fact even more at the moment, are using that. They do not know that that little group of people in that tiny little congregation made a very brave choice to work with people that they didn't know. But that's what happened. And as a result, all those people enjoy that green space in the city centre. They are blessed by it, especially at the moment. And so blessing just flows. Now, these 8 responses that I have identified are not, of course, in any way exhaustive. If you have read Grace Outpouring about the Brennan community, you will know that the grace response that they identified was a regular pattern of prayer. They call it the rhythm of prayer. And that is their core. The assets that I talked about to you earlier come from another church, comes from St. Martin in the Fields. Name your assets, cultivate your assets, cultivate the assets in your community. It's a response that is in line with the heart of God, and so it just draws on God. In John's Gospel, and I won't find it because it'll just take time, in the prologue it talks about grace upon grace. So grace came with the laws of the Old Testament because the society was given some boundaries, and you know what it's like with children and in workplaces. When the boundaries are good, society works better and everything works smoothly. But Jesus didn't come to improve the rules. He didn't come to get rid of them, but he didn't come to improve them. It's not like he polished them up, or an analogy doesn't immediately come to mind. Thank you, Martin. And but it says upon, so it's on top of. It's not that they're improved. It's another grace is added on top of, and that's what we've experienced, is that as we step out graciously towards God, he then puts another layer of grace on top. So it's grace upon grace. So what I've identified as being operational at St. Stephen's in the last 11 years is that people have held difference together. They haven't resolved it, and I can send you the list. They haven't wanted everybody to be the same, which of course we know is impossible anyway, but they have held difference together. And that's what they did when they entered into the conversation with Lend-Lease. They were prepared to have a conversation with people who they had no knowledge of. They embraced choice. In some ways, my first talk was just to highlight to you the choices that you have that you may not have thought of. So sometimes we can feel powerless when we're not. And that actually choosing is really important. It's a gift given to us by God. And if we use it graciously, then blessing will follow. Pursuing the living God. Pursuing the living God. For my parents, it ended up them becoming Roman Catholics, because in the 1950s there was healing talked about in the Roman Catholic Church, and then much later, when they were back in New Zealand again in the 70s, they were filled with the Spirit in a Roman Catholic prayer meeting, and they pursued God. Pray creatively, which means any way that suits you. Don't limit the ways in which people will pray. Just pray as many ways as you possibly can. I've come across a book recently that names sort of 9 different ways that fit with personalities as to how they like to pray. We like to pray differently. It's to do with our personality, with our gifting. Stay thoughtful. I mean, that's what you're doing now. That's what you're doing in this series. You are looking for new information. You are thinking about it. You are exploring it. You can see God at work in such a myriad of different ways around you. But stay thinking about it. I don't know about you and technology, but my sister, who is only 14 years younger than me, says that I am better with technology than she is, and it's because I have to use it. I wouldn't choose to be. I wouldn't choose to have learnt how to Zoom. That's a new verb that has just entered into our language. But because I have a job that involves me needing to do this, and I'm way behind, but learning new things, thinking about things, practice practical compassion. This is very real and live for us because we have homeless people coming into St. Stephen's all the time, and we have to work out how we're going to respond. And just giving them food is not necessarily the best response. Responding practically and thoughtfully is not always simple, and you will know that. You will know that when you walk in St. Stephen's and somebody asks you for money, you don't know whether to give it to them or not. And so in terms of the whole church has had to practice compassion, but to do it very, very thoughtfully, and we're still learning. Accept personal variety. We are unbelievably different, and yet we all start by thinking that everybody else is like us. And it's just such a big thing. There is so much misunderstanding because people are just operating out of who they were meant to be, which is different from you or me. I have a son-in-law who is extremely creative. He actually is in security print and is involved with designing passports. He's incredibly creative, and his brain goes like this. And when he did a building project, he had scaffolding up to mend the roof, but he didn't get the bits painted because he's not logical. If he was logical, he couldn't make these wonderful, amazing, exceptional designs. We're so different. And the last is that when we put aside our differences and when we work hard at working together, God just blesses us. And that's, I've heard you say this right at the beginning, how, through these circumstances, you've got to know each other better. You're working more together. And from that, blessing will flow. I want to read you something because it's just really helped me. We're so familiar with the parable of the prodigal son, and if you unpack it, you know that it is a most outrageous story, that no Middle Eastern man ran anywhere, certainly not to some wayward son who'd been in the pig's trough. It's an extraordinary story, but of course we're not in that culture that we don't. Well, we do see it, but we have to keep on revisiting it, because the extreme hunger of God for us, the extreme love of God for us, it is often watered down, and we get deceived that God doesn't love us. Or the extent to which he loves us. It's a small account from the film 101 Dalmatians. Well, I imagine some of you will know the story of 101 Dalmatians. There are two adult Dalmatians, Pongo and Perdita, and they're 15 Dalmatian puppies. And they're all watching TV, and they're waiting for the right moment to escape from the wicked Cruella de Vil. And one of the puppies, Roly, despite being captivated by the film, says, "I'm hungry, Mother. I'm hungry." Perdita, "Now, Roly, you've just had your dinner." Roly insists, "But I am. Just the same, I'm so hungry I could eat a whole elephant." Sam Wells, who wrote this, says this: "There are two kinds of hunger. There's a hunger that has a name. It's a hunger where you know what you want, but you haven't got it or can't have it. When you're interviewed for a job and you can't understand why they didn't appoint you. When you long with all your heart to have a baby, but it's not happening. Where you're dying for something to eat, but the cupboard's bare. When you just want something in your life to go right for a change, but people keep letting you down. Such hunger can become all-consuming, transforming your temper, your relationships, your patience, your charity of thought, your whole character. We are what we eat," they say. "We're also capable of becoming contorted into the shape of what we hunger for." But there's another kind of hunger. It's a hunger that lingers deep, disturbingly, in the bottom of your soul. But it doesn't have a name. There's no simple solution to it. No hot meal or job title or box ticked that will satisfy it. The Irish band U2 famously articulated this second kind of hunger when they sang with longing and bewilderment. "I have climbed the highest mountain. I have run through the fields, only to be with you. I have run, I have crawled, I have scaled these city walls, only to be with you. But I still haven't found what I'm looking for." Rather more vividly, the Rolling Stones, tired of the ordinary and weary of the wild song, "I can't get no satisfaction, 'cause I try and I try and I try and I try." The reason these songs stay in the memory decades after their release is that they identify a point deep in the gut where hunger lingers, the hunger that doesn't have a name, the restless yearning, aching, gnawing, longing hunger that knows when it hasn't found what it's looking for for that knows when it's got no satisfaction. That is the hunger that God has for us.